Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome. We'll just give everybody a moment to get in, get settled, get figured out, and then we will get started. We're so glad you're here. We know this is a really busy time of year, and we're grateful that you're spending the evening with us today. So just as people filter in, we will get started. So welcome everybody to our part 2 to our wonderful webinar series, Grade 1 Planning from Data to Instruction, kindly organized and run by the wonderful Monette Smith. And we're so glad you've joined for a part 2, and I'm looking forward to hearing from her again tonight. I think we can move on to the next slide, Melissa. Thank you. Fantastic. So we'd just like to acknowledge that ONLIT's work takes place on traditional Indigenous territories. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. And we are thankful to be able to work on this land, and we are thankful to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people for their care for and teachings about the earth. This acknowledgement reminds us of our responsibilities to our relationships and to the ancestral lands on which we learn, work, and live.
Thank you so much. And again, just like Una said, thank you so much to everyone for coming. It is a really busy time of year. Part of the reason why we're doing it right now is that we really wanted to honor the fact that a lot of boards are starting to do their middle of the year screening. And so we wanted to give you a little bit of direction. And also, as you'll see at the end, we've got so many events happening with ONlit right now that this was one of the only days that we had available to us. So again, starting with the disclaimer that I do acknowledge that I'm coming to this and looking at this data with a lot of knowledge that maybe you're still on that learning journey. And I totally recognize that that can be really overwhelming. I think you will see from the data that we have tonight that I am too overwhelmed by some of my data. And I hope that we can sort of walk through it. Another thing that I wanted to say before we got into this is that I'd really hoped that I would have had my data completed and had a round of progress monitoring done to show you. But unfortunately, my board only opened up the data collection on the online platform on Monday. So I say that with just for you to give me a little bit of grace that a lot of my thoughts and my thinkings about what I'm going to be doing and talking to you about and how the changes I'm going to be make are really, really fresh in my mind. And they're not necessarily coming to you with the same proof behind it, right? Last time I was able to show you what I'd been doing for several weeks. Now I'm sort of giving you an idea of what I'm hypothesizing I'm going to be doing. And I think there's a lot of value in that also. So again, tonight we're going to be looking at my classroom context. We're going to be looking at that middle of the year universal screening. I'm going to show you some of my updated instructional routines and my connected practice, both what changed from the last time we met in, I don't even remember when it was, last year at some point, as well as what I plan on doing now that I have my data. I'm really hoping we will have some time to really get into those questions and answers as well. So without further ado, let's get going. Just a reminder that I teach in a suburban school with 22 students, and they come from a variety of ethnic backgrounds. I have several students who are listed as MLL learners, and they are both Canadian born and foreign born. So I really have a nice mix of students. We're not talking about sort of a mono culture in my class. There's a lot of things happening in the classroom. So to begin with, here's a snapshot of where we sort of left off in part 1. And if you haven't seen part 1, you are totally welcome to stay tonight. I think there's still a lot of valid learning, but I will be referring back to some of those things. It is available on YouTube, so you're welcome to go and watch that. But where I left off was we had these groups of students. And so I talked about how I had used the universal screener as well as some diagnostics to sort of form my groups of what I was going to do. And when I started, you can see here that I had 4 students of my 22 who were working way beyond the grade 1 scope and sequence. That it was not something that they needed. Phonics was not their main need. I had 11 students who were really working at that grade level. And so when I say at grade level, what I mean is that they came from kindergarten, they had their consonants, their short vowels, and some of them had digraphs and some of them were able to read some consonant blends, but they were really ready to go with that grade 1 scope and sequence. I had 4 students who were at that level, but they really did need supports to stay there. And I had 3 students who were missing a lot of letter sounds. They weren't able to read CBC yet, and they needed some intensive support. From that time up until December, when we left off, my groups shifted. They changed. I still had those 4 students who were working beyond grade level. I had 5 students now. We had managed to get through our scope and sequence up to Magic E, and they were working with like complete proficiency, reading and writing, no problem with Magic E. I had that 11 students again, they sort of switched, who were reading Magic E and they were developing that fluency, and they didn't need a lot of support. Like they were doing it pretty much just with explicit instruction. And then during the practice time, they were able to apply it all by themselves. And then I had one student who was still developing that fluency with CBC. She still needed support with the blends and with digraphs. And that was like a constant need from her. You'll see there too, a little asterisk there. If you're thinking the math isn't mathing, I do realize that that's 21 students. I had a student who left me for 3 months. She has now since returned. She was on an extended leave. So that's why you'll see 21 students there. So this is where I left them in December. And then through that January period, we did do a review of some of the sounds. We hit the ground running really like no time after the break. We went right back at the concepts and kept moving along our scope and sequence. And you can see that I had 4 students, again, those same 4 students who were really above and beyond where they needed to be. I had 2 students who I noticed were reading slightly ahead of the scope and sequence. So when I gave them decodables that were maybe out of line in the scope and sequence, or if they were just reading regular text to me, I was like, oh, hang on, they are able to do that without much explicit instruction. I still had that core group of 11 who were at grade level. They were able to work independently and they were staying there. They were just doing what they needed to do. And then when I dug a little bit deeper, I said, okay, well, I've got these other 4 students. They're at grade level, but they really need my help staying there. And then again, I've got that one student who was still significantly below where they needed to be and requiring that intensive support. That student actually came back to me after the 2-week break for the holidays and had lost several letters as well as the digraph. So we had regressed a bit and lost our ability to do some of the skills that we had. We know that happens all the time. And I think it's just sort of a testament to that daily support and that daily rigorous, explicit instruction, and that practice was really what was supporting her learning. So again, forming those first groups, I knew I needed help with those short vowels. We had missing alphabet sounds. We weren't reading these types of words yet. We didn't have fluency within those CBC. These are, again, I'm talking about those first groups I had back in October. We needed help building beyond fluency beyond. And then I had that group of kids who were above the end of year scope and sequence. This was the group that I knew I could get to in that whole class. So the kids that fell into this group, I was pretty confident that my tier 1 instruction was going to be exactly what they needed to keep them moving. I knew too that I would be able to help this group out as long as their connected practice. So whatever they were doing independently and what I was asking for them to do outside of the explicit instruction was at their grade level. And so for these kids, it really was about connecting their reading skills with their comprehension. So I had these kids who were reading, and then I was giving them a lot of comprehension activities and answering questions. We know too that I had this group here with the short vowels, but I was still, again, I was pretty confident that because I was going to be spending so much time working with short vowels in my tier 1 instruction that I didn't necessarily need to pull these kids separately. And of course, I had that core group that became my priority, right? These were the kids that I wanted to spend most of my time with, and I was able to get that going. So when we think about this, sorry, I'm just going to zoom through here because I got some things highlighted. When we think about how they evolved, what ended up happening was that they sort of shifted and their skills shifted, and the number of kids requiring intensive support I was able to get that to a smaller, more manageable group. So when we think here, again, I had a lot of these kids who were still building that fluency with their blends and their Magic E. This was a good number of students. They could read words and sounds in isolation, but we were really working on that sentence and that passage fluency. Again, I thought to myself, like, I'll be able to work with this mostly in our whole group instruction. Like, we're getting at it, we're getting through it. I use the word thought there for a reason, and when you see my data, you'll see what I mean by that. I thought that I was making a difference there. This group here again, that gray line were the students who were working on comprehension and vocabulary instead of new sounds. And then of course I still had this group of one, right? This student who continued to lag despite all the interventions. So this is where I was at the end of last week. So again, I started screening on Monday. At the end of last week, this was what my plan was. I've got the kid that I need to get reading. I've got this group who they're ready for a lot of work on that sentence fluency and passage fluency. I've got that group that is of 4 students who's working on vocabulary and comprehension. And then this green group here is sort of a new group. This was something that I had not intentionally overlooked. If you remember in the first time, I talked about how you want to use the diagnostics as they become relevant to you. And I hadn't given a diagnostic on high frequency words and spelling because my data was showing me that I still needed to work on decoding. So throughout the first term, it became really evident to me that this high frequency words was holding some students back. So over the month of January, I really altered how I was doing that. So Anita Archer coming up, I cut all that fluff. I was getting rid of those activities that were fun and instead went back to that explicit instruction and really just working through those sounds and repeatedly having them read those sounds. And I was able to see a lot of improvement for that. So thinking again about that long range plan, when I say scope and sequence, when we're talking about our long range plans for phonics, again, we have long range plans across all of the subjects we teach. But for phonics, I'm talking specifically about what sounds are you teaching and when. When we look at the new curriculum, we are so fortunate this time, whether you agree with what's in it or not, but we have a scope and sequence on the B2 Language Foundations continuum that shows us what should be taught in each grade. And when we look at grade 1, which is what I'm teaching, but I honor the fact that a lot of you may be teaching in different grades, the grade 1 is quite heavy. There are a lot of sounds. I think I counted last time, it was about 60 sounds, depending on how you talk about it. And so when we look at that scope and sequence and our long range plans, it's really just the plan to teach all of those and how you're going to teach them. So I know it's tiny on your screens, but when you look at my long range plan here, which is different than January because I did have to update it because this is a living document and we go as fast as we can, but sometimes you have to slow down and sometimes you have to repeat things. You'll see that I have a couple of things happening. I do have the phonics concepts across the top. They are numbered because the program I'm using is numbered. And then I've got my morphemes down here that I'm using for my morphemes. You'll see again that in September, I did a bit of a boot camp style where we were doing 1 letter a day and I was getting all of my diagnostic information and we were just doing alphabet, 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 all of the alphabet, all of the time. And we did that for a good 5 weeks until about Thanksgiving when I was able to get my Acadians done and look at all of those information together. I was able to pick a spot on that scope and sequence to begin, and then off I went. Again, if you're looking for more information on that, it is in the first, in part 1. So I would feel free to go back and pay attention to all that because it is really tricky to figure out where you need to be on a scope and sequence and how fast you can go. But things that you need to remember is that if you're using a commercial program like UFly, which a lot of Ontario school boards have chosen, that is your scope and sequence, and that is your long range plan for the phonics concepts. When you're using these programs, what you want to make sure that you're doing again is that you've got that multiple sounds a week. So the research is pretty clear that when we go 3 or 4 sounds a week, or as many as you can, that kids do better, right? We want to make sure that your program is also systematically reviewing those concepts after they've been taught. So again, if you're using a program like UFly, you'll notice that, you might be doing short A this week and next week's short E, but you'll see those short A sounds come up again in the words, right? That's the concept of interleaving where we're coming back and forth to those concepts. It's not just one and done. A lot of questions about the long range plan or your scope and sequence are like, how do you know if you can move on, right? So you need to check. That is an informal way of progress monitoring where you are checking to see if they can read the sounds, if they can spell the sounds. We don't need to worry too much specifically on the fluency in that whole passage, because again, if you're using a systemic program, those sounds are going to come back over and over again. It's not just one and done. That's not to say that fluency is not important, but it's certainly not something to hold them back from moving on to that next sound. When you're looking at your whole class, again, it's that sort of 80% threshold. It's not an exact science, but if the majority of your kids have mastered that sound, so they've been able to read the sound and spell the sound, then you're probably good to move on, right? If you do something and they don't get it, then you might want to hold back. An example of that is when we were doing soft C and soft G. Oh no, it was the Y at the end of the word. So Y at the end of a short word makes the long I sound. All of my kids could read it. They could read that word to no end. All of my kids were reading that word. They were even reading it in multisyllable words, like in the name Tyler, but none of them could spell it. And well, okay, I'm being a little bit hyperbolic there. Most of them could spell it, but I was shocked at how many of them were still putting an I instead of a Y. So I had to make that decision. Do I keep going or do I go back? Right. And so because they were reading it but not spelling, I decided to keep going, but I made sure again that the next week's work, when we were going onto that next concept, that Y at the end of a short word that says that a long I sound was still there. And that when I was doing my progress monitoring the next week, I included words that had that concept. So they had a continued opportunity to practice that sound. Again, if you're using a good program, like a well-researched program, you really don't need to worry too much about it, because somebody far smarter than us has already decided that that is the order that they need to be taught in, and has gone through. If you're not sure if your program is following that, I believe it's the Reading League has the guide with its own little rubric of how you can check and you can see what types of program. But again, for most of us in Ontario, we are using a program such as UFly that has already been thought of for us. So I'm going to remind you of where my kids were at with those Acadience benchmarks. So again, thinking when you see my little people, I've got them all color coded for you. Red shows that they are well below, which means that they are likely to need intensive support. Yellow is that they are below the benchmark and they need some strategic support. Green or blue, I've split that person in half, is at or above the benchmark, and they likely need that core support. And when we say core support, we're talking about that evidence-based tier 1 instruction. So again, thinking about Acadience, if you're brand new, they are those benchmark goals that are empirically derived, they are criterion reference target scores. And what's really interesting is that the target moves, right? So that's what we're here to talk about tonight, is that the target has moved and we've introduced a whole new thing that we're going to be looking at tonight, and that can be tricky. So when we see here that little visual, that's a screenshot taken right from the overall Acadience benchmarks that show you what we are doing at the beginning of the year. We're here in the middle of the year, so we're looking at that nonsense word fluency again. We're looking at oral reading fluency. If you're not using Acadience, a lot of what I'm going to say tonight still applies. Your numbers might be slightly different and the terms that they use might be slightly different, but for the most part, it's the same idea. So when we look at my phoneme segmentation fluency from last year, at the beginning of the year in September, you can see it was about half and half. And I'll remind you again that I was shocked by this, because I was pretty sure that I was hitting on that phoneme segmentation, like bang on. But I had a lot of kids who struggled on that. And you could blame the test. You could do whatever you want. You can blame whatever you want. But at the end of the day, I had almost half my class that weren't doing it. So I went reflective and I looked at myself and I was like, well, I'm doing a lot of it in whole group, and you can cheat whole group. So it's possible that these kids are pretending to say the sounds. I'm not really saying the sounds. So I decided to make this a bit of an intervention group. Nothing major. We weren't sitting down for, 15, 20 minutes a day, but I had my list of kids who are like, okay, I'm going to check in on that. And anytime they finished work, I'd call them over and we'd go through it. We would just practice hearing those sounds in isolation. And that was really all that they needed to move up. I'll remind you that my nonsense word correct letter sounds was okay, not great, but it was pretty, I still had a good chunk of kids who were not saying enough sounds fast enough. And when we looked at our whole words read, I had even more kids. We talked last time too about the fact that a good chunk of these kids, I think it was about 6 of these kids, had exactly one word. And I was concerned, right? Because one word is great and the benchmark was one word, but I knew already that I needed to get them to 8 words for this January benchmark, and that was going to be a little bit tricky. So we talked again last time about how I turned all of that into action, all of those results, and developed a plan, right? So I had my group of the kids who I was going to look at during my soft entry. That's my morning time when we're waiting for announcements to happen. So I would pull those kids. And then I also was going to make sure that my whole group instruction, my tier one instruction, was better at teaching them how to segment longer words as well as that whole word reading. And then I had that group of kids who really did not quite have their decoding skills down yet, and they weren't really reading their letter sounds with enough fluency. That was the group that I was going to work with during my daily connected practice. So that was my plan, and it was going really well, and I was doing great with it. Again, looking at that language block, you can feel free to look in that. I go into it in more detail in that first lesson, but we're going to go through this a little bit quickly. You'll see here it's a little bit different. As I started to teach, like as I was going through December, we were able to change some of the stuff. I noticed that my kids didn't need the rigidity. They didn't need it to be so structured, as long as I was still hitting up a lot of those skills. So we were doing our 3-part drill a little bit differently. I wasn't doing it exactly the way I had been taught, or how like a UFly program has it laid out. It was a little bit more relaxed. We were doing it sort of more informally, a lot of whole word reading, just changed it just a bit. Also to honor the fact that my kids were getting better at those skills and they were getting a little bit bored. So I wanted to keep it more fresh and interesting. But for the most part, it stayed the same. Again, if you want a copy of the daily plan, it is on the ONlit website. So you're happy to look through that. It is a little bit different, but I go in and explain some of these pieces a little bit more. My connected practice sort of stayed the same for most of the time between December and January, except that I brought in partner reading. So partner reading, we'll talk about it in a little bit. That was a new thing. That was a goal that I was getting to. I needed to get enough kids who were reading fluently to be able to do it in a meaningful way. So that was really the only thing that changed. I still was doing a lot of decoding practice, encoding practice, sentence building practice, as well as comprehension in that proficient group. Again, that's not to say that I wasn't doing comprehension with the other groups in other ways. It was just that they were independently practicing that. And I still continued on with that ready for reading, which was them reading decodables to the teacher. Those were all going really well for me. I also had a lot of progress monitoring happening. So again, I was using a formal progress monitoring with my Acadians. I had 8 students enrolled in the phoneme segmentation fluency, and I had 14 students enrolled in nonsense word fluency. If you have a photographic memory and you're looking back to the slide that I just showed you, you're like, but Melissa, you didn't have that many kids who needed help. I wanted to make sure that I progress monitored the kids on the nonsense word fluency who only got 1 or 2 whole words. I wanted to make sure that they were moving towards the goal. I didn't want to wait and find out they hadn't reached it. So that was a personal choice for me. These progress monitoring, if you have Acadians online, like I have to do it through a school iPad. Even I used to do it paper and pencil. It was not really a big issue. They're so fast. Like it's 1 minute. And so I could pull over a kid for 1 minute and just see how they're doing to check to make sure that my instruction and my intervention was making a difference for this child. I also continued on with my informal progress monitoring. I use the daily pen review, which again is on ONlit for those of you interested. I only use it once a week. Laura Bross will use it every day. I use it once a week in the program, and I do it at the end of the week as a way to check to make sure that they have the sound, the word, and the sentence dictation skills. And again, I kept seeing lots of progress, except for that one time with the Y as I. So that's what I was doing. Again, this is right up until Friday of last week. I was able to learn a lot from my progress monitoring, which is why I continued with it, right? Increasing those opportunities for segmenting words improved the outcomes for all students except for one. So every student who struggled with phoneme segmenting fluency on the first beginning of the year assessment improved, except for one student. That student still improved, but not as much as everybody else. That soft entry intervention and that extra support during that connected practice, it improved all outcomes for all the students involved. So even though I had students who didn't make as many gains, every student was moving forward at an accelerated rate compared to where they started. Excuse me. I was able to reduce the number of students requiring extra support from 7 to 1. So I started out in October with 7 kids in front of me doing all of these decoding activities and these reading activities. And by Friday of last week, I only had 1. Everybody else was able to do it independently at different rates, obviously, but they were getting it done. Being able to reduce the number of kids requiring intensive support is so important because the students who really still need it now get extra support, right? I'm not split 7 ways anymore for this one student. My instruction evolved to move away from that rigidity of that 3-part drill in whole group. So remember, that's one of the things that changed. But what I hadn't realized was that actually that was having a negative impact on that one student. So the student who is not making as much progress because I wasn't doing the 3-part drill with the showing them the sounds and them saying the sounds, them writing the sounds, and then them reading the sounds, blending them together the same way, that student actually sort of stalled out. And so I thought that was a really interesting reflection to be able to look at your whole group and you're working and all these kids are doing well and you're able to change your instruction. And then I noticed that one kid's not moving. And after talking with my amazing grade partners, we realized like, oh, it's because we changed the instruction and the mode of instruction was working for her. And now she's not getting as much of it as she needs. So that leads us to middle of the year screening. #MoyJoy. We are so excited to be here. If I could capture the excitement in my school building this week when Acadians Learning Online opened up, I would sell it to all of you because the primary teachers, even actually the junior teachers too, they were all doing it. They see the power in this assessment and they see the growth and they were so excited. And I'm just so proud. And again, I put that as a privilege to work in a building where there are so many other teachers who are just as pumped and excited and motivated to see this change in their students. So here we are, middle of year screening, and we're in a bit of a conundrum here with some government mandates and some union rules. So we will tread lightly. But thinking about what I'm about to tell you, please follow your board's guidelines for screening because the interpretation of the memo might be different. I chose to screen all of my students because I found the data really useful. So who did I screen? Well, I screened all the students who did not meet the beginning of year benchmark. So that is what's mandated. The verbiage over who has to do that might be slightly different depending on your board's interpretation. In my board, we had the option to do it ourselves or to have one of our literacy teachers do it. I chose to do it myself. I also chose to do all remaining students. And excuse me, I think you'll see as I go through my data why I'm so happy I did that because it was mostly the students who were fine in September, and I use fine, obviously, the term they were at benchmark, that are most concerning now. So they may not have been screened. They didn't have to get screened, but I'm so glad I did. So other reasons why I chose to screen everyone was because the benchmarks change, right? They increase significantly. Again, we're moving from, it's a moving target of what we're trying to do. And I wanted to make sure that my students were on track the way they needed to be. We've also introduced a whole new concept here. We are introducing that oral reading fluency for the first time. And again, I don't want to wait until June to find out that they're not reading fluently. I also like to think that I have a really keen sense of how my students are going to do. So I sat down with, again, my teaching partner and I said, I think I'm going to try and predict. I want to try and predict these results. So this is my prediction. This is what I was expecting from my students. I thought I would have 4 well above, 3 like just a little bit above. I thought I'd have a good group of 7 in that yellow range that weren't quite there. and that I'd probably have about 8 that were below. So again, more than half my class below, but I really thought that they would be on that cusp, and we'll see in a few minutes what actually ended up happening. But yeah, so thinking again, what are we screening? So here we are in that middle block. We've got that nonsense word fluency. That is not different from September. We did that at the beginning of the year. But you can see that there's a significant difference. We go from 27 sounds, correct letter sounds, to 43 sounds, and then one whole word read to 8. That's a big jump in my opinion. You're almost doubling the sounds, and you are obviously making, I don't know, it's not quadrupling. What's 2 times quadrupling? Eight-drupling? I don't know what that term is, but you are doing that to the whole words read. So it's a big jump. We're also including that oral reading fluency, right? So we're looking at how many words correct and what percentage of those are accurate on a sort of typical grade 1 level text. Something to think about oral reading fluency, and there's so much out there if you're confused at the difference of that. But just to talk a little bit about the difference between oral reading fluency and running records. And oral reading fluency assessments are often confused with those running records. I'm going to read you something specifically from LD at School, and maybe Una can put that in the chat. It's in the box there because I thought it was a really great passage talking about how in a running record, the fluency is typically assessed through a teacher observation or a rubric. But when we're using the oral reading fluency, it's being scored against benchmark criterion that have been derived from a lot of predictive probabilities. So it's more scientific. It's less like, well, I think they're doing okay, or that. It's very specific to a whole program. And if you're looking for more information on that evidence-based assessment, that link that from LD at School has a lot of great information there. So this is what we are going to be assessing. What we're looking at in the next few slides are their ability to read nonsense words, both on their correct letter sounds and their whole word reading, as well as their ability to read authentic text. Well, the passages. This is where we ended up with correct letter sounds. So you can see that we've got some reds there and we've got some yellows. I don't like seeing reds, and I'm sure I'm not alone there, right? It hurts. You're just like, it's hard not to take it personally, but we worked so hard, but I do all this, I did all the things, and it's, yeah, I did all the things. But let's take a little bit of a deeper look. Let's breathe. Let's see what the data is actually telling us. So here's we're looking at my beginning of the year versus my middle of the year. So you can see here again, my lovely yellows and greens, that was at 27 correct letter sounds. Here we are now at 43 correct letter sounds. It is a big jump. And I still have more kids in the green and blue than I did at the beginning of the year. So I'm going to count that as a win, because I had 6 kids below before, and now it's only 5, and it got a lot harder. So thinking again, one thing that was interesting when I went really deep is that this group here that I have the box around, through my progress monitoring, they all surpassed the beginning of year benchmark. So I got them all to read 27 or more correct letter sounds. So even though they might be below on this new benchmark, they had made significant gains from the beginning of the year. Here's that whole words read. Again, I don't love seeing those 2 reds or those other yellows there. But again, choosing to look at the data and see what the data is telling me. These 2 right here, these 2 yellows, they had 7. So if you remember from the previous slide, that we needed 8. So they are so close. These kids are so close. It's not a win yet, but it's such a close win. And I'm going to just take that as a positive, right? We are reading whole words. And look how many blues there are. So many kids who are reading whole blue, those blue words at such a high rate that they are well above. So again, I could choose to focus on those 4 that are not meeting benchmark, but the data is telling me so many great things also. Here's that side by side again from beginning of the year to the end of the year or middle of the year. You can see, again, I got a lot of blues. I got a lot more greens. Those 2 yellows are almost green. So there's a lot of great progress happening on the nonsense word fluency. And now we take a deep breath. Okay. This one stings. This one stings a little bit. Um, I I was I was I still don't have words. I'm still like shocked. I'm still a little upset. Um, and I'm gonna let myself feel that way, right? It's hard. You want your kids to succeed. They're working so hard. My littles, oh my gosh, they work so hard every single day. They are begging for snack time because they're so done with all the work that they put in. So this was hard. It was hard to look at, but beyond just seeing if they are, below, well below, at, or above, the data told me so much. And so that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on what the data is actually saying, and we're going to get into that a little bit more. Thinking here about the accuracy, I mean, it's not great. It does align well with the words correct per minute. I'm really sort of flabbergasted at the black and white of it all, right? Yes, I have that one yellow, but for the most part, they either fully can or they fully can't. There's not a lot of in between. My progress monitoring did not predict this, right? It did not show me that I was having an issue. I did know that some kids were like maybe not reading as fluently as they could be, but for the most part, they were reading decodable text with no issue. So again, I get curious, right? I got a little bit sad, and now I get curious, and I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into this data. These splits here, what you're seeing on the left side are the words correct per minute score versus the accuracy score. So they kind of are aligned, right? Like kids who were not reading enough words also weren't reading those words accurately, with the exception of this kid. So this kid was reading slowly, but really accurately. I think she was in like 83 or 85, like well above the accuracy that she needed. So she's really intriguing to look at. And it's for me, that's a really clear piece of data that this kid just needs to read faster, repeated reading. I know what to do for this kid. The other kids are a little bit tricky. They're not reading accurately, but they're also not reading fast enough. So there's two things going on there. So then I thought, well, what else can I compare? So what you're seeing here is their whole word read, that's on the left, and their words correct per minute from their oral reading fluency. And this is where it gets really, really interesting for me. So again, we're looking at the nonsense word, whole words read versus the words correct per minute on the oral reading fluency. So again, remembering that whole word read, that is about understanding the alphabetic principle and basic phonics. Reading from left to right, saying each sound, blending those sounds, but not even having to blend them first. Like they were reading the words at like immediately as whole words. They were not sounding out. When we look at this group here, there are a significant number of kids whose whole word reading on the nonsense words was fine. Look, there's one that's even blue, right? They were reading whole words with no issue on those nonsense words. They have a strong understanding of the alphabetic principle and the basic phonics, but it's not translating. It's not moving over to that authentic text, that connected text. And that's where the issue was lying, right? So that was the problem. Yes, they could read words and decode words, but when they were in a new space, in a new type of text, they weren't able to apply. So now my brain starts going like, oh, okay, now I need to do something. What can I do about that? So when we think about all of the scores, we can compare from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, right? So, or the middle of the year. So here is my beginning of the year you can see that I had 8 students that were below on whole words read, and now I only have 4. That's a big win. I cut that in half. Like that's a lot of work, and it got harder. It's not that it stayed the same, it got harder, and I was able to reduce that. At the beginning of the year, I had only 14 students who were at or above, and now I have 18 students. So again, the data is quite promising on some aspects, and it's a little more challenging on others. Again, when we look at that oral reading fluency, you can see that 45% of my students are not meeting benchmark for words correct per minute, are and 55% aren't. And if you're sitting there thinking, wow, those little graphs and donuts are so cool. I didn't do those. Those came all the way from Acadians Learning Online. So if you have access to Acadians Learning, they're all on the program for you. So you can look at that. So here's that words correct. And then here's that accuracy. It's pretty much half and half, right? It's not ideal, but it is consistent with the results. You might find that you have more of a discrepancy between the two. So if your data is showing you that they are accurate, but they are low on the words correct per minute, then you have more of a fluency issue, right? There's lots of things we can do to build fluency. But because both of the scores are low, it means that for my students, they aren't reading the words fast enough, and they're also not reading accurately enough. So here's an overview again. I apologize that it's small. It is color coded so that you can see, but here's all 22 students. You can see the first two columns are the nonsense word fluency, and then we move into that oral reading fluency, and then that reading composite score. It's interesting when you look at the actual scores and how they relate to each other, but still for the most part, you'll see that I have 3 students who across the board need a lot of intensive support. And then it sort of changes as we go. I've got that group of students who are not reading whole words, that are reading whole words, but it's not translating. And then I've got that group of students that is doing quite well. So again, thinking about what I was expecting for 4, we're going to be well above, 3 above, 3 below, 7 below, and 8 well below. This is what I kind of ended up with. I was pretty close. In some ways, I think the data turned out better than I expected. I thought I was going to have a lot in that middle zone. It turns out that I've got a lot more doing a lot better than I expected, which is always nice. And I have about the same needing that intensive support, which I had expected based on the data. It would be really easy of me to blame the test and say, well, the test is too hard, or it's an American standard. Like I could absolutely go down that road and explain it that way, but that wouldn't serve any purpose. And it also wouldn't be true, because when I look at the data and I want to see if it makes sense, I looked at what I had explicitly taught them. So I'd gone over consonants, short vowels, initial and final blends, magic E, soft C and G, even that EE sound, right? Because we had it in one of our high frequency words. These are the morphemes we did. A lot of morphemes, also some comparatives. I did some multisyllabic words, but not tons, but some. And I did several high frequency words. But when I looked at the actual errors, only 2 kids made errors beyond the scope and sequence. The rest of the kids were making errors on the concepts we had learned. So the whole idea that it was too hard, not for my kids, because they made mistakes on the things that I had actually already taught them. I did have 4 students who were even discontinued right after that first passage. So if you haven't done the oral reading fluency yet, your students are discontinued if they don't get 10 words right in that first line. So I had 4 students who weren't even getting 10 words out of that first line of, I think, 13 words, right? So that's a high percentage of words to be missing. I also had 3 kids who were skipping the entire lines of text. I will say to you that I was a tricky convert to the online. I didn't like the online. I really liked the paper and pencil. But this time, having done it on the online platform for the very first time, I had never done it online before. And even though I've been doing Acadians for 3 years now, I was actually able to pay better attention to their reading behaviors using the tablet than I was on paper and pencil. So for all of my work colleagues who I said I hated the online, I am revoking that and I am saying I like it now. I was able to pay attention to those reading behaviors better. A lot of kids were skipping lines. That is not something I was anticipating. And I'm thinking, like, being reflective about it now, a lot of the stuff that I give them is a single line per page. So they're not having to track from line to line. A lot of it is a single line per page, and that could be an explanation. I had a lot of kids who refused to use their finger, and then they kept getting lost and they were trying to figure out where they were. So again, some of those reading behaviors that were really helpful to know as I was doing it. So in the case of mine, does the data make sense? Yeah, it does make sense. I taught them the majority of what they needed to know. So that wasn't really the issue. Um, I'll talk about this more in a little bit, but I absolutely, the first thing I did when I got my data was basically just send it to people that are smarter than me and ask them for help. And so of course I sent it to the rest of the ONlit team and I was like, what to help, please help. And a lot of the team members reminded me that this is the very first time that I am assessing their oral reading fluency, which is looking at that language comprehension, right? And so it's the first time I'm doing it in a formal way, and that I should take some of that into consideration when I'm looking at these results. For some of the students, I do know that there is a their language comprehension is affected by being an English language learner. Like that is true for 2 of the students that were below benchmark. And then of course I'm thinking now too, looking at the vocabulary and background, like we know that those are really important. In terms of the 3 passages that were chosen here, so if you haven't done it yet, there's one on a jump rope contest. It's possible that they don't know what a jump rope contest is. My school in particular, we don't do jump rope for heart, so it's hard to know. They might have some limited experience reading nonfiction about animals as well, because there was a passage about bees. But there was also a passage about playing card games, right? And so most kids have enough background knowledge to make sense of that one. What was interesting to me is that that passage was the hardest one for all of my students, was the passage on Go Fish. So we're going to look at that in a bit. Thinking again, are the tests too hard, right? This criticism comes up a lot. The screenshots you're seeing here, it is the expectation from Acadians, what the benchmark goals are. And then you see here a screenshot of the B2 continuum. And what you see there is pretty much every sound, right? So grade 1 has a lot to teach. So is it a lot? Yeah. But if the expectation is that we have to teach all of those sounds that are listed on the screen in front of you, then the passages are absolutely in line with what we are expecting them to know by the end of grade 1. So and remember, like, we're not looking for too much here. That very first oral reading fluency is 23 words correct in 1 minute and a 78% accuracy. So knowing that I had taught most of what they needed to learn, and knowing that I'm expected to teach them pretty much everything, I went back into each of the passages to look at some stuff. I did a deep dive. Here's the first one, right? Here's a sample of the first passage. What you see highlighted is a concept that I hadn't necessarily taught my kids yet. Everything else, they should be able to read because we had done those types of words, right? Even contest and compete. We had done closed syllables and we had done closed Magic E syllables. We'd looked at those things. So if they had gotten everything right that I had taught them, we'd be looking at 31 correct words per minute. And we would be looking at the 73% accuracy. In Go Fish, there's a little bit more. Again, it would only be 24 words correct per minute and 65% accuracy, which could explain why my kids did poor on this passage, because there are some concepts there that are there's more concepts that we haven't taught. And then when we look at that busy bee, again, highlighting the words that I wouldn't expect them to necessarily know because we hadn't taught them yet. I would expect to have 30 words correct per minute and about 73% accuracy. So you can see that, well, like, these results would not have resulted in an at or above benchmark score, but my students were really, really off. They were nowhere near as close as they could have been based on the explicit instruction that they had been given. And again, I say that with a firm understanding that taught does not mean learned, right? It is not a direct line from me teaching you to you learning. But even with my progress monitoring, when you looked at their skills from week to week, it was surprising to see those results. So what types of errors did they make? So here's a student. The first pillbox here is the whole words read. The second pillbox is the words correct per minute. So this is a student who read well above the 8 that she required or he required. But you can see that they were the mistakes they were making, right? Day is a word that we see all of the time. We've got a magic E word. These are all concepts. is one of our high frequency words. So that was in there. Here's another student, same thing, making a lot of the same mistakes. This student got a little bit further along, which was great. This kid here, as you can see, their whole words read is in the blue, well above where they need to be, but was missing words like it and was, were, right? So looking at the data does give you a little bit more insight. And again, these come directly from the online part. So what do I know now about my class in this post screening? Well, 9 kids are at or above benchmark on all subtests. 1 student's reading accurately, but not quite fluently. 1 student was approaching ORF benchmarks on both rate and accuracy, and they were okay on their nonsense word fluency. But I have 6 students with strong nonsense word fluency skills, but need support with accurate and fluent reading of connected text. And I have 4 students requiring support with both basic phonics and accurate and fluent reading of decodable text. So that made me think, what if I looked at their ability to read decodable text, right? So this is what the universal screener showed on their ability to do oral reading fluency. And here's what happened when I took a decodable passage, fluency passage, that was 2 concepts behind. And there's no science behind why I chose 2 concepts behind. It's just that I wanted to honor the fact that those concepts hadn't had the same amount of interleaving to necessarily be as stuck in their brains as the concept to the ones that we had already done. So I chose the magic E, which was 2 concepts behind, and let's see what we see. So when I look at their fluency rate on the decodable, it's a lot more manageable. You can see that it, I still have these 2 groups. This group of kids who are not reading their decodable properly. They're sounding out all of the words instead of reading them as whole words. The first student was saying the sounds, but not even blending them back correctly. So for instance, it was going like d, og, cat, right? Not saying the sound at all. And then I had this student who was definitely still well below where they needed to be, but was actually reading whole words. But you can see that I have now 6 kids who were reading the words exactly like I taught them to, and they were reading them as whole words, and they were meeting the benchmarks that they needed to, right? So I had 2 kids who weren't quite there on the rate, but look at those accuracy scores. So while the ORF is what I'm using to drive my instruction, and I still need to make sure that I'm working towards reading fluently the connected text that is more in line with reading an everyday text, using a decodable passage just like took a lot of weight off me. And it made me realize, okay, what I'm doing is working. What I'm doing, the students have fully responded to, and they are applying in that context. So instead of me looking at things that I might be doing wrong, it's more now of a conversation of what do I need to add? How am I going to get them to that next step? So a note about these passages, I don't use the UFly program, but I used their UFly decodable passages. So if you just type into Google UFly fluency passages, they have their pilot program. I don't know if it's gone to full use yet, but I was just using the ones that all say pilot or draft on them. And I just picked the concept that was closest to the concept that I wanted to. Again, it's not my scope and sequence, so I did go back in and check to make sure that the sounds were, and connected to what I was trying to had been teaching them, and so it worked out for me. I also tried a fluency passage generator. There's a lot of those on the internet where you just type in the text that you want and it'll put all the numbers and stuff beside you. ChatGPT will also make one for you. The one that I had them do with the prompt, I think I said the prompt was write a decodable passage with consonants, short vowels, magic E, and consonant blends. And so it wrote out a lovely little passage. And then I said, do it again, but put numbers, count the words on the side. And it just gave me the passage. So there's lots out there if you want to use it. I will be using the Acadians passages as I go through for actual proper progress monitoring. But this was sort of a little bit of a science experiment to see how did the two sets of skills come together. 12 kids in an intensive group is too many, right? I cannot small group my way out of 50% of my kids needing help. But using this extra measure, this fluency measure on the decodable practice, it really highlights that within that group, there was two very distinct groups of kids. One who was not reading and not able to apply what I was teaching in isolation in terms of the words to a passage, and then the group that was. And so how I address those two groups is going to be slightly different because their needs are different. So thinking about those updated instructional routines and the connected practice, again, if you have not watched Laura Bross's 2-3 instruction data, well, I forget what she calls it, her webinar on the grade 2-3 language block, you should really, really watch that one. It's on the ONlit website. It is a great one. There's so many wonderful practices. I am an avid follower of Laura on Instagram, and I take a lot of my ideas from her. So I would definitely look at that. I would also highly recommend on YouTube the Kate Wynn webinar that she did a few years back on the changes she made in her kindergarten program. Again, some really great things for that grade 1 year or whatever intervention, whatever grade you might be working on. A lot of great ideas in both of those webinars. So thinking again, once I had my data, I needed to think about like, what are those instructional implications of that data? And so I came up with some questions. What do I need to change? Who should I focus on? What are my new groups? Who's ready to fly? Like, who have I been holding back? Because that is evident in some of my data. And then who can I ask for help? Because I don't have to do this by myself, right? There are people out there who know what they're doing. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. So again, thinking about this block, this again is my explicit instruction. This is what I do. Not much is going to change here because my data is showing me that for the most part, my explicit instruction is working. However, I need to spend more time with connected text. I am not giving those students enough time in front of a text that is long with a teacher supporting them. So I've got to figure out a way to increase the amount of time that we are spending with that connected text together. So you can see here, I do a Monday to Friday schedule. It just works for me. It works for the kids. They know what to expect on each day. I don't have to spend a lot of time explaining activities because we just do the same activities every time. They're not bored by it. They feel really, I think, a sense of purpose and a sense of responsibility because they do know what to do each time. So I'm not going to mess with a good thing. I will say that one day out of the cycle, I have a shorter language period. And that happens to fall on a day 3. And right now, day 3 is on a Friday, which is when I do all my assessments. So that's a little bit tricky. So I'm going to have to figure out a way to get some of those in. I like it better when that day falls in the middle of the week because I can move some stuff around. So not much is going to happen with my whole group instruction because for the most part, it's working. My connected practice, this is what I need to change. So the things that we are doing have to figure out. So when you see here, the decoding bin, the encoding bin, and free choice, this is where I had a shelf of activities, like game type manipulative things. Well, they're gone. It's not serving them anymore. They're just playing rather than building skills. So though that stuff's gone, I'm not doing that anymore. We'll see what happens when I take that out because I need to find a space to put in something else. So that's what's going first. This spin, say, write, again, that was sort of like a little bit of a fluffy activity with their high frequency word, with the idea that it would help them spell high frequency words better. It wasn't working. It's gone. It's done. I'm over it. I'm not doing it anymore. So what am I going to do instead? Okay. So I'm going to bring in some authentic text. I'm going to give them the opportunity to read some of those longer connected texts and the authentic text. That's going to be part of the expectation of what they are doing when they are doing their independent work. This is things like Elephant and Piggy, right? Those are really great, short, engaging texts where the text doesn't heavily rely on the the picture's related, but it's not like this is a paint can, here's a paint can, right? Like it's there, but it's not necessarily there. And the kids love them. I'm also going to switch up what I'm using for those partner readings. So I was using decodable text, like actual books. And then I found a free resource where it's linking decodable passages with a specific high frequency word that we're learning at that time. So that's what we've been doing for the last 2 weeks, is using that for partner reading. And I'm going to keep going with that because that is definitely helping with their reading partner skills. I'm going to go back to having specific groups that I see on specific days. I'm going to spend some time with those 12 students who need help with that connected text on that new concept. I am going to spend some time again with those those students who I thought were reading independently that really maybe need some more support. And then I'm still going to listen to everybody read at least once a week. That student who's not reading at grade level yet, the one who is still at the CBC level, I'll still take that student every chance I get. Anytime there's a lull, I work with that student, especially in that soft entry. I'm also going to look at my soft entry, and I think it's still really, there's benefits to having it because of the social type, but I'm going to make sure that maybe I can build in a little bit of structure there. They're used to some structure, and they could probably use it. So thinking about those instructional groups, I still think I can keep going with my whole group scope and sequence. I think the majority of my kids are trucking along, picking up those sounds, that I don't need to change that. So I've got those 4 students who are always ahead. They'll continue to be ahead, and I'll continue to support them with language comprehension. But now my data is showing me that I've got 5 students who are ready for more of a challenge. So I've got to think of ways to increase their opportunities to respond at a higher level. How can I engage them and continue their development? I happen to have a set of decodables that are the alphabet readers that I really like because they have comprehension questions at the back. So I've been getting kids to read their book, read the question and answer. And so that might be something I start doing for these kids as well. I've got these 6 kids that need that fluency and accuracy that I'm going to have to work with. And then I've got those 6 students really needing that scope and sequence support. Like they're on the scope and sequence, but I'm only going to keep moving them if I give them more support, especially in that application. And again, I still have that 1 student needing that CBC support. And if you're out there right now being like, oh, look, 5 groups, that must mean 5 rotations. No, that's not how I do it. Just because I have 5 groups of kids doesn't mean that I have 5 groups moving from station to station. It's not working in my class. It doesn't work for me. It's actually never worked for me. That's too much planning on my part, but we will have a lot of these kids being met with in targeted ways during that connected practice, during that small group learning time, but it won't be in rotations. As I said before, like look at the bottom line here, that's 13 students that need help. I can't do that in small group. I have a whole group problem. I can't small group my way out of that. So thinking about all of those pieces, I'll probably link some of these kids together because we'll be able to support them, but then I can also support these kids together. So again, instructional routines that are not changing, I've already gone through. So here's something that I introduced, and I'm going to say it really quickly. I think Una's going to put in the chat there a couple of links. Lindsay Kemeny has a great video that's on our website. Laura goes through, again, her whole partner reading routine. Mine's a little bit different, again, because I am teaching grade 1. But basically, the gist of it is you organize your students from most fluent to least. You split your class in half and then join them back again so that the top of the bottom half is matched with the top of the bottom of the match. There's so many words on there, but I have a visual. Choose a text that supports their learning ability. So imagine you've got them all listed and you split them and you put them together like that. What was interesting is post-screening, my order of kids did need to change. And so I did get some new partners out of that. So this is something that I'm absolutely going to keep going with. It is very, very well researched and well supported in the evidence. It is a little tricky in grade 1. I do have a few kids who don't do well without an adult there with them. So I'm just being mindful of that and checking in with them. But for the most part, this is what we're doing at least twice a week and hopefully every day. I'm going to continue on with this ready for reading. So those of you who missed part 1, basically all it is during our connected practice time when they get a chance to read whatever the task is that they're doing. When they feel ready to share, they put their name on the board, and then I come over and I read with them one-on-one. You can see here, I just use a simple Google form. You can see here that I just add whatever skills as we go. I add the skills to the form, and I can click off whatever skill they've worked on at that time. And what's really great is I can use different things. So again, I'm going to be bringing in more of that connected text with the decodable that we're doing, as well as authentic text. And we've started using fluency grids as well, because I really wanted to check. So you can see here, the data that I get is it's just so easy. I just put their name and I put the date and I click on what they were working on and then whatever notes I want to put, right? So it's really easy for me to see. That is not going to change. I will get less time every day to do it because I am going to be spending more times in those priority groups, but I'll figure it out. I'm also going to keep my oral language. So what you're looking at here is a screenshot of my screen on my whiteboard. These are like which one doesn't belong. There's so many free ones. I just do it. I sing the old Sesame Street song. If anybody's old enough to remember, the one of these things is not like the other thing song. But what's so great about it, we do it first thing in the morning. It really gets their brain going. My kids are so engaged. They love to talk about why they think something doesn't belong. So again, we're using those higher order thinking skills, but I can also use it to teach the other subjects. So we just finished our Everyday Matters material structure long title science unit. And you can see here, we went through and we talked about what each of those materials was probably made out of. I also can use it to reinforce the vocabulary and the morphology. So you can see we're splitting concrete. We're talking about multisyllabic words. We had the word rearrange. We talked about the morphemes that go with it, learning the word hedge, right? So there's just so much out of this 5-minute routine that I'm not going to get rid of it. It's so good. And it's such a great way to get them going. So knowing everything that we've just gone through, what are my plans for progress monitoring? I'm going to have 4 students enrolled in those nonsense words, and I'm going to look at it every 2 weeks, right? So you can set the frequency. And the reason why I'm going to do that is I really want to make sure that they are gaining on these nonsense words, because it's such a foundational skill to be able to read words like that I really want to check in on that. I'm going to have 12 enrolled in the oral reading fluency. And for some of them, I'm going to check every 2 weeks because their reading skills are so good. They're just not applying it to their oral reading fluency. I know that the alphabetic principle and basic phonics is not the issue. So it's about that connected text. But those other 4 students, I'm going to do it on a longer time frame, right? I'm going to do it every 4 weeks. The problem with oral reading fluency for kids who are not reading yet is it's not super sensitive, right? It's not going to show me the growth that I want to see. It's going to be teeny tiny incremental. So that's why doing the nonsense word is still a great one, because I'll probably see bigger gains, but I don't want to forego it altogether. So I'm still going to check in on it. I'm still going to do my informal progress monitoring with the ready for reading, but I'm just going to give the kids more robust materials. I'm going to let them do some self-selected texts. Again, I talked about those Elephant and Piggy. I have a bunch of other authentic books that are right at their level, especially as we gain more and more phonics skills. I'm going to continue with the daily pen review 1 day a week. So my weekly pen review. Every time I say it's time for daily pen review, they go, but we only do it once a week. And it's just the joke that we have. I'm still going to keep doing with it. It's a really quick, easy way. It's super fast to mark. I just keep track of what sounds I said on my phone, and then I just look through it. And it's an easy thing to share with parents too. So that's a whole other webinar about what and when to share with parents, but sending home those progress monitoring is a really great way to show them the progress that they're making. I'm also going to do more with those decodable ORF passages. This was the first time that I had done it this week. But I really liked the data that I got from it. So I'm going to keep going with that. We're also going to be introducing a grade 1 group at recess. So again, I've said this before and I cannot reiterate it. I am so privileged to work in a school with amazing teachers. My specific grade team, there's 4 of us that are grade 1 teachers, they are amazing. And we are in this together. All of our kids are each one of our kids. So it doesn't matter that they might be in another class. We care about these kids and this growth together. So one of the things that we're going to be doing is a recess group where we'll be pulling the kids that we're most concerned about, and we'll be looking at the other kids who are getting some support. So those are my plans moving forward, things that I'm going to do. Before we I finish off, and we will have time for questions, which is so great. The one of the questions I had is, who can I ask for help, right? So I've mentioned I have a great grade team. I have a wonderful school team, and I'm lucky enough to be on this ONlit team. But you have access to us, right? You have that ONlit email. If you've got a question, feel free to ask, right? You don't have to be alone in this. Get your grade team going. If it's not your grade team, maybe it's in one other teacher in a different part. Like if your school's not where my school is on that data, find somebody who will help you champion, who will help you look at that data and make sense of it. And if it can't be your school, then look outside of your school. But again, if you really need to, absolutely look at that ONlit team. We are here to help you, and we are happy to answer your questions. I don't want to end on a bunch of hypotheticals, so I just want to go back to this data. So I want to end with a win. And so again, here's the beginning of year nonsense word fluency. And when you look at this, you see so many kids, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kids who were not having the correct letter sounds to make benchmark. You have so many kids who could not read a single word. Here's the middle of the year. And so, yeah, I've got some kids who went down, some kids who didn't have a lot of growth. But when you look at like some of these kids going from 0 to 7 words, right? 1 to 12 words, 0 to 17 words, 3 to 21, like that's huge growth. And it will be very easy to look at your oral reading fluency and see that a lot of it's read and to just be like, well, the test is awful. That's it. I'm done. But I hope that I've really encouraged you to look deeper at that data to see what it's telling you and to really celebrate the wins. Like there are so many wins in my data, even though it didn't happen the way that I wanted to, and it didn't look as great as my partner next door's data looks. There are so many things to celebrate with my data, looking at comparing from the beginning in the middle of the year. And when you look at these kids, some of these kids didn't need to be tested. And I could have just waited until June, but I would have missed this amazing opportunity to see what their skills really were, where their needs really were, and then do something about it before it was too late. Question. Do we have anything?
Yes, we do. I've been keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A. So just a reminder, I know there have been some questions popping up in the chat. If you have questions, please pop them in the Q&A box. Melissa, I'll let you take a moment, have a drink. You've just done a whole lot of talking, a whole lot of wonderful talking. Thank you. And I'm going to save the chat for you so you can read it after the fact. But I think certainly a lot of people have been putting in the chat what I was thinking as well, of just really appreciating your authentic, genuine perspective on your data and your students and all the incredible work that you and your students have been doing this year, and just really really appreciating sort of that honest look and reflection on what on what you've done so far and what will come for the rest of the year. With that, Melissa, if you are ready, I've got some questions. There were some questions. If you could chat a little bit more about the resource around high frequency words, something that connects high frequency words.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so that is free through Tara West. So whether you like her stuff or not, or you fly, like the book, is the partner reading? Is that what you're talking about?
If you had that question about that, I know there were a couple people who were chatting about that high frequency word piece. I'll keep an eye on the chat to see if that, yes. Okay. Yes. The answer is yes.
So Tara West is a product. You can buy it. You don't have to buy it. The free stuff that she has is really great stuff. And if you have our newsletter, it sort of came through that. It matched the scope and sequence that I was teaching. And the kids really like it and they're really engaged. So it worked well that way. I have seen ones for UFly as well. Um, really, you're just looking for passages that use the high frequency, the ones that you're working on. And what I liked about this one was that it was matched along with the other things that I was teaching. So that's where it came from. If you look for Tara West free, it was absolutely free on one of her weird giveaway thingies that she has all the time. She gives away all half of her stuff. But yeah, that's where that one came from.
Reflecting on that, it just makes me think of how many words with irregularities are also function words, right? And words where having context is quite, quite helpful. Yeah, that's an interesting. I'm just reflecting on that. There's a question which I want to make sure I ask you because we often talk about that scenario of what do you do if your data are scary, right? I feel like that's language that Melissa often uses.
Yeah.
So there's we talk about that sometimes. There's a question about having 16 out of 21 students who were below benchmark at beginning of year. What advice would you give this educator? She says she doesn't think she can small group her way out of this. And I
Yeah.
would to agree.
Yeah, no, you can't, right? And in some ways, like I find that really like empowering, like that you can do something about it in your whole group, right? You have this opportunity to look at what are they spending the majority of the time doing in front of you, and using that time to move them forward, right? And then you can practice it again when you do that connected practice or that small group time. So when you look at that 16 out of 21, that's pretty scary. That's a lot of people that aren't doing it. I would need more information to look at it specifically, and feel free to send me an email. I'm melissa@onlit.org if you want more specific. But look for the skills that are missing and start there. Is it letter sounds that they're missing? Start there. Is it the ability to read whole words? Start there, right? And one thing to remember is you don't necessarily need to go back to kindergarten, though. You don't have to do the kindergarten scope and sequence. Like if you're following UFly, you can still start at grade one because those letter sounds and those short vowels and those reading those short words are in the program. Like they're there, but you really do need to see exactly what the data is telling you about which foundational skills are missing and then start with those skills and then just keep moving forward. But that whole group instruction, right? Figuring out a way to teach everyone at once is really important. And I would say, like, I don't use UFly, but there are a lot of things there that are free that are really great for help to help you. There's a lot of great videos. I think we have explicit instruction videos too about what you can include. There's a lot of great how-tos where you can watch teachers do those routines that are really helpful in moving kids forward.
And one thing I'm thinking of, what you might, if you're wanting to do some more digging about how to sort of manage, you know, patterns of clear need across I'm
Yeah.
trying to think of a way of framing it, like patterns of need across a large proportion of a class. What you could do some look into is something called class-wide intervention. Patton, which is the Technical Assistance Network out of Pennsylvania, has done a couple of really great webinars and sort of highlighting how to think about, they sort of give that rough idea where when the median of your class data is below benchmark, right? That's meaning thinking about the median, that means that half of students are above it, half of students are below it, right? So when the median sort of falls below benchmark, which I'm assuming this person probably would, again, thinking about how can we sort of structure that? Some people will call it like tier 1.5 or class-wide intervention, but how can we really think about bumping up the intensity that everybody gets, knowing that it's not feasible to think about small group instruction unless it's something where students are grouped across grade level or, unless there's some sort of a different structure. But absolutely.
Yeah.
And
And
then,
there's what
oh, sorry,
before
go
you get to
ahead.
the next question, there's something I wanted to say. Like, I just want to remind people, I literally screened yesterday, today, and the day and Monday, right? So all of that data, like that, all of that, including the fluency passage, I did in the last 3 days. So I know that's something that we're like, well, but the government says this and the union says that. Like we've done a lot of things before where we did those PMs and we did all those things. Like we did all that testing. Like none of this took long and none of this was hard. And I even got to teach a lot of the content that I said I was going to teach this week. Like I didn't have to, I did give up a recess. I will be honest with that. I gave up one of my recesses and one of my preps because I wanted it done in time. But there was like, it's not hard to pull these kids here and there throughout the day when you get a time. So I didn't need to find a full, day of time where everyone was quiet to do this. Like I did it in the classroom, just like we always did. And I got all of this done. And I got it done quickly so that I could make the changes right away. Right?
Can we just segue sort of along this same topic of thinking about bumping up core instruction, thinking about, really amping that up when there's a lot of need across a class. How do you do that while also using a board approved resource is my question. Or not my question, but is somebody's question.
So board,
I know.
okay. This is where Una laughs because I am a rule breaker and that is just how I am by definition. But board approved versus board suggested, like I use the training that I have. Now, I do recognize I have training that maybe some people on my board don't have. I am Morton Gillingham trained. I've taken the IDA course. I've taught the IDA course. Like there's a lot of other training that I had that has allowed me to use any program and to use it to the benefit. But you can absolutely do, if your program is UFly, everything that I've just talked about is in the UFly program. They might just call it something different, right? But they have that 3-part routine. They have the visual, the auditory blending. They have phoneme segmentation. They have phoneme blending. They have connected text. Like these commercial products that are chosen by boards and approved by boards are very likely approved because they have all of the elements that we've determined. So even though I might not be using a program, that comes specifically from my inability to follow a program. Like it's just not how my brain works. I need a little bit more creative license over things. So you'll see that I pull resources from here and there, things that I like and things that I go to use. But if you are being told lock and step, it has to be UFly, you will have success. I think, who was the guy that just had that study that we talked a couple weeks ago about the fidelity of UFly when followed with fidelity of, 2 sounds a week, 5 days a week is incredibly successful. So I'm not using UFly because there's something wrong with UFly. I'm not using UFly because of my inability to follow rules. That's all I'll say on that one. There's nothing wrong with these commercial programs, right?
Can you chat, Melissa, about whether you get any pull-out intervention? Is there support for students with really significant needs? What does that look like in terms of more intensification?
Okay, so again, I'm York Region School Board, the English Board, public board. We have a role called the culturally relevant and responsive primary literacy teacher. And it varies from school to school, but in general, that person has a 0.2 contract. So they have about 40 minutes, 50 minutes a day over the 5-day cycle to work with students and teachers. So at our school, we have that teacher. We have a little bit extra literacy support that we are allocating around the building and pulling booster groups. So my students are not currently being pulled because I wanted to keep them and I thought that I could best serve them. Now that you're seeing that I have one kid that is just not keeping up with the rest, it might be in her best interest to be part of a booster group that's more intensified at her level. We're sort of, those are questions that my grade team will have to decide. But those opportunities exist. My actual students are not accessing those at my school yet. They might, now that we see what the data is. We do have to have a conversation as a whole grade team, as a whole primary team, because that role is K-2 on how we want to support those students. And that's the whole purpose of doing the data, right? Like the data is not just to check a box, say we did it. It's to drive that instruction and to drive that intervention. So we've been doing our intervention groups for about 2 months one way. Now, what does the data tell us about what we should do for the next 6 weeks, right? So that's the conversation we haven't had yet.
Okay. Well, I'm keeping an eye on the time. I want to be respectful of everybody's time this evening. I know, Melissa, is there anything else you need to share with the crew this evening
Yes.
before we wrap up?
I just want to say again a super heartfelt thank you. Like this is amazing that you guys are here, that it's report card time. This is a crazy time of year, but I'm really honored to speak to you and to share this lovely data with you. And hopefully, I think the thing I'm hoping the most that is my excitement over this. You know, we've been saying at the ONlit team hashtag #MoiJoy, right? We are so excited about this middle of year data that yeah, it can be a bit of a pain and yeah, it's a bit of a nuisance, but so much amazing information. But also that ONlit and February seem to be really busy. We've got let me just see, we've got Laura Bross coming up tomorrow with that
Tomorrow.
harnessing the science of learning. She's
And
got special
if Laura,
guests.
I was just about to say, if it's not enough, if seeing Laura every other Thursday night isn't enough to get you to join, it's Laura plus like a dream team of other awesome people joining her as well. So, um, good things coming is what I'll say.
My family has ski club Thursday nights, so I have to watch these after the fact, but still amazing. We have a cat chat screening data Saturday morning with Jordan and Marlene. So if you have questions about this type of data stuff Saturday morning, if you're available, they are having that. Pour les Français, we have another book study happening in French with Chantal and Jordan on explicit instruction. And then next week, we have Nellie and Lee with their teaching skills for complex textbook study. So much happening. And that is all I have on that part. But lots coming up on the calendar.
Lots on the calendar, that's for sure. I looked at the calendar the other day and sort of it ran away with me a little bit that we've got quite this much going on this winter, but we're so happy to see you all and to engage with you all. Melissa, a huge thank you. I'm going to make sure I save the chat so you can see all the wonderful messages and all the love that people are sharing with you. But I know for me, and I know from everybody who's sharing they're sending their good vibes your way. We really appreciate how you've really candidly framed that out and sort of walked everybody through your thought process and what you're doing. And I wonder if we could convince Melissa to do a part 3 at the end of the year to see how it all went. I don't know, maybe.
Listen, it all comes down to your timelines. You and Alicia get to decide that, not me. I will do anything, I will.
Melissa's
If
a
not,
yes
and if
girl.
not that, then maybe some blog posts along the way too.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's true actually. That's okay.
Yep.
So we will find I think the chat has spoken and then I think we will do a part 3. I think.
Great.
Yeah. If you're good with it, I think a part 3 might be
Absolutely.
our way. But no, everybody, please reach out. In the meantime, we're happy to chat. Melissa's, I am, our entire wonderful team, info@onlit.org. We'd be happy to connect with you all, and we will let you go. It is 8:31. We're past time. It was so wonderful to see you, and please stay in touch.
Thank you. Have a good night.